November 12, 1943. In a dimly lit office inside the Bendler block in Berlin, two of the Wehrmacht's sharpest minds sat in silence. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the faint echo of distant traffic outside 76 Tirpitzufer, the headquarters of German Army Intelligence. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, the head of Foreign Armies East, leaned over a stack of captured Allied documents spread across his desk. Across from him sat Colonel Alexis von Roenne, his counterpart in Foreign Armies West. Both were meticulous analysts, men who lived by data, logic, and precision. But the papers before them contained something that no amount of reasoning could soften, a truth so devastating that it threatened to shatter everything the German High Command believed about the war. They weren't looking at battle plans or intercepted communications. No, these were ordinary American logistics reports, dry bureaucratic forms filled with rows of numbers, typed signatures and delivery schedules. Nothing dramatic, at least on the surface, yet within those numbers lay the cold mathematical reality of Germany's impending defeat. Gehlen's eyes lingered on a requisition form from the US Fifth Army in Italy. It listed the monthly supply figures for a single American corps: fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts. At first glance it seemed routine, but as he read, the color drained from his face. The Americans are delivering more ammunition to one corps in Italy than the entire German army received on the Eastern Front in the same month. He looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. This cannot be accurate. Von Roenne said nothing. He checked the figures a dozen times, cross-referenced them against every available source: fuel reports, aerial reconnaissance, agent data from neutral countries. It all told the same story. There was no mistake. The Americans were outproducing Germany, not by a margin, but by a scale that defied imagination. The numbers were merciless. A single US corps had consumed over 3.2 million gallons of gasoline and nearly 1 million gallons of diesel in 1 month. For comparison, Army Group Center, with 3 full armies and 500,000 men fighting on the Eastern Front, received less fuel in that same period. In that small Berlin office, the two colonels realized the terrible truth. Germany was no longer fighting the Allies. They were fighting arithmetic itself, and arithmetic always wins. This moment of clarity had been building for years. Back in 1940, before the first American soldier had set foot in battle, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had stood before Congress and declared that the United States would produce 50,000 airplanes a year. In Berlin, the announcement was greeted with laughter. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring reportedly chuckled, saying Americans could make refrigerators and razor blades, not war machines. To the German leadership, Roosevelt's words sounded like fantasy, propaganda meant to boost morale. After all, in 1939, the US Army ranked 18th in the world. Its tank designs were obsolete, its army tiny. Its factories focused on cars and toasters, not tanks and bombers. But what the Germans didn't see was that beneath America's apparent softness lay a sleeping giant, one with immense untapped industrial reserves. The Great Depression had left thousands of American factories idle and millions of skilled workers unemployed. Assembly lines that once built cars and tractors could be instantly converted to produce tanks and planes. When Roosevelt called for rearmament, America didn't need to build an industrial base. It simply needed to turn the lights back on. Germany, on the other hand, had been running at full capacity since 1933. There were no idle factories, no spare machines, no reserve of labor. Every expansion required new construction, new conquests or slave labor, all of which took time. Germany no longer had. For a while, this imbalance remained hidden. In late 1942, when American troops first landed in North Africa during Operation Torch, German commanders expected little resistance. They saw the Americans as inexperienced, soft and naive. At first, they were right. At Kasserine Pass, Rommel's seasoned veterans drove the US Army back in disarray, inflicting heavy losses. But something didn't add up. Within days, the same American units that had been crushed were back in fighting condition, fully re-equipped with new vehicles, fresh supplies, and endless ammunition. Rommel was baffled. He wrote to Berlin that each US infantry division seemed to have more trucks than an entire German corps. Supply convoys rolled endlessly through the desert. Captured American supply dumps contained more food and fuel than entire German armies. Rommel warned that even if German tactics triumphed in battle, They could never overcome American logistics. Berlin dismissed his reports as defeatism. Hitler scoffed, insisting that willpower and courage would triumph over material advantage. But by 1943, that illusion was collapsing. When the Allies invaded Sicily and later Italy, German forces found themselves facing an enemy, with resources that seemed infinite. Captured American soldiers spoke of throwing away entire meals simply because they didn't like the taste. They described vehicles abandoned over minor mechanical issues because replacements were so plentiful. At first, German interrogators thought it was exaggeration or propaganda, but then the captured supply reports began arriving. Typed, signed, authenticated, there was no room for doubt. The Americans weren't just well supplied. They were operating on a scale that made German logistics look medieval. Von Roenne and Gehlen worked through the data night after night, trying to disprove what they were seeing. If one American corps in Italy consumed this much, and there were dozens more operating in the Pacific, North Africa, and soon Western Europe, the math was merciless. They ran the figures again and again. It always ended the same way. America's logistics capacity exceeded Germany's entire war production by several orders of magnitude. Americans could replace in 1 month what took Germany half a year to produce. Cut to wartime production footage. Tanks rolling off lines. Aircraft hangars filled with B-17s. In 1941, the US had built just over 4,000 tanks. By 1943, it produced more than $37,000. Germany, even at maximum effort, managed barely 11,000 that year. Aircraft production told an even darker story. In 1942, the Luftwaffe built about 15,000 planes, the Americans 47,000. By 1943, they doubled it again. Over 85,000 aircraft rolled off American assembly lines in a single year. By the time Germany reached its own production peak in 1944, America had already left it behind, producing nearly 100,000 aircraft annually. And then came the Liberty ships. To the Germans, these reports seemed pure fiction. How could the Americans build 10,000-ton cargo ships in just 6 weeks, sometimes in less than 2? Shipbuilding had always been a slow, intricate art, but reconnaissance photos and agent reports confirmed the impossible. Dozens of nearly identical vessels filled American harbors, a fleet being built faster than the U-boat could sink them. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was already lost, not because German submarines had failed, but because American factories had made them irrelevant. Back in Berlin, Gehlen finally pushed the last document aside. He looked across the desk at von Roenne. Both men sat insolence. They had been trained to find patterns, to forecast outcomes, to provide clarity to commanders who relied on their analysis. But this clarity brought no comfort. They weren't facing an enemy that could be defeated by tactics or willpower. They were facing an entire civilization mobilized for war. A machine that could produce faster than Germany could destroy, replenish faster than it could kill. In that quiet room surrounded by paper and the dull hum of electric lights, both officers realized the same truth. Germany's defeat wasn't a matter of if, but when. And the war, they understood now, was no longer a struggle of strategy. It was a contest of industry. And industry, vast, tireless, and mathematical, had already chosen its victor. America's victory in World War II wasn't just won on the battlefields of Normandy or the skies over Europe. It was forged in the roar of assembly lines, the clang of shipyards, and the endless flow of fuel, steel, and ammunition. For men like Gehlen and von Roenne, that realization came not from propaganda, but from cold numbers taped on a page. And in the end, those numbers told the most devastating truth of all. Germany hadn't lost to soldiers. It had lost to mathematics.